Hello guys, today we will be talking about What If Naruto Had Time Travel Jutsu Part 3 Finale. If you enjoy this video please like and subscribe. Now let's begin. His ramen steamed in small wafts, cooling quickly against the rain and buffeting wetly against his face. With rainy eyes that matched the scenery, he felt that his appetite had long since diminished in the midst of his onslaught of depression. Sadly, it took him a while to even realize to call it such. When Sakura had pointed out with that melancholy look that formed over her gummy pink lips that he had stopped smiling for a while now, he didn't exactly know what to tell her. Because, for Sakura, everything was in black and white, with gray undertones and that was that. And it wasn't her fault, Naruto mused as he used his chopsticks to pick up the noodles. Bad things don't happen to Sakura, bad things happen to people around Sakura, and then by a chain of events she gets affected. To that end, Naruto would never want Sakura to have any bad fortune bestowed upon her at all, but there were kinds of pain that could only be understood by personal experience. Loneliness was one of them, dark and inky in its blackness, coiling around his very eyes and frothing against his feet. The pain of true, extreme loneliness. And suddenly, just as sharp as the stab of pain that had washed over him, did he hear the sound of a bowl breaking next to him. He heard it the same time he felt it. Vaguely he would remember the sound of the ramen chef placing the bowl next to his fellow rain-soaked companion, and it was the only warning he had ever received. However, if he only remembered the warning some 4 months later, then it wasn't really a warning, was it? But, nevertheless, the hot liquid splattered his bare legs like liquid fire, and if he hadn't had the life of a shinobi, he may have been on the ground in pain. But he had, and he placidly looked down at his feet in the dim haze of simple-mindedness and hadn't noticed the spring of pain that came along with the hot broth that pooled around his feet. If things had been different, or maybe a different person, Naruto would have turned back to his food, but that wasn't the case. What? The voice was one of the most heart-wrenching he had ever heard in its simple and soft agony, so small and tiny and broken that it hurt to ever hear it, rasping barely over the clatter of the rain on the other side of the stall. The hell! Even with the curse, the voice didn't change pitch. Naruto looked up, startled, to meet his own rainy blue eyes to hazelnut brown ones. Naruto. His name carried a bitter undertone in her voice. His eyes widened. She looked the same. Rin. Her brown hair was mussed and dripping a little at the bottoms where it hadn't quite dried, and the small droplets of water looked crystallized as they dropped and scattered to the floor. The bandages on her cheeks were ripped a little near the seam that met her cheek, and the edges were beginning to brown. Her cheeks weren't as plump as they had been, coloring with tinged pink as she breathed faster, and her lips were round and gummy, the way he remembered Sakura's looked when she got upset at him. For an instant, he was about to brighten into a smile when her storming eyes stopped him abruptly. "How dare you?" she hissed. "Where the hell have you been for the last 2 years?" she shrieked. "Rin, I know you listen to me. Where the hell have you been for the last 2 fucking years, huh? You don't just disappear like that. Ever. You can't just abandon your friends and think that it'll be alright, think that we won't care. Do you have any idea how terrible it was when we suddenly woke up and you were gone? Like you had disappeared off into the distance and we had no idea where you were, when you would come back, if you ever were coming back, and did you have any idea how much it hurt?" Her breath rattled in her chest, and in the wake of her screaming the ramen chef and Naruto both were stilled. "It hurt a lot." Her voice dropped back into that whisper quality, shoulders shaking uncontrollably and her lip quivering ever so slightly. "You have no idea though. It hurt because we trusted you and believed in you, and where did it land us?" Her bitter voice trailed off until the pitter-patter of the rain had drowned over them in large watery eddies like a grave on the sea, with nothing more than a sprinkled light passing from the depths above them. Rin's breath heaved in her chest, bursting into her lungs, and this fiery and painful sensation was welling up from somewhere inside her, and it hurt. "Say something, goddamn it!" she yelled at him, swiping the chopsticks that lay unused on the counter, and throwing them at him. Naruto had nothing to say in his defense, not bothering to even dodge the flying eating utensils, nothing that could possibly justify his actions to the girl. No, the woman, She was most definitely a woman now that stood before him, with an open grieving heart that was breaking in front of him. But the emotional stress was getting to him. Slowly, he put his head in his hands that were rested on his knees, shaking his head, and the gloomy ashen color of the storming sky made his sunshine hair look flaxen, and almost dull. "I'm so sorry, Rin," he sighed at last, sounding just as broken as the woman before him. "I really am. If I could have told any of you, I would have in an instant." Rin froze so suddenly, that Naruto was tempted to look up. The moment that she pulled her hand back as inconspicuous as possible did he realize what she was reaching for, and decided it would be better not to alert that he knew she was holding a kunai behind her back. She must have been upper chonin now, maybe even special jounin, regarding herself. But she had a while to go before she could fool him. "What?" she started slowly. "Do you mean by that?" He paused. This was going to mean everything. No. This was everything right here. This decided his very future, his very fate that he now cradled in his hands so gently. His next answer was going to decide whether he would leave this time period and never return more out of necessity than of his own true decision. He would never see Obito, and Rin, and Kakashi, and Minato ever again, although it didn't seem like right now he'd be able to spend time with them the way he had before, considering their opinion of him now, and he'd have to return to his own, very sullen, and very saddening time period. And as he watched Rin's face, she was all grown up now, with sculpted cheekbones that no longer resembled a cute child, with a pointed chin and dark eyes, and look at her, even ready to draw a kunai against him. He knew that there were only two options that laid out with him right now. He could feel her tense as the seconds passed by, and could watch her shoulder still and the muscles tighten ever so slightly through the saffron fringe of his bangs. He could feel the small shaking that the thousands of torrents of rain caused upon Konoha's soil, trembling in the sheer power of so many sheets of droplets sailing down on it that it was overpowering, and he could hear it begin to slow its erratic tempo, the rhythm slowing and the clouds lazily moving on. He took a deep breath. "Everything, Rin." She blinked. The muscles that had tensed in her arm relaxed a bit, but not by much. "What do you mean?" she echoed herself, cautiously. "I never told you guys anything," he began in a quiet voice that matched the hushed tones that she had set. "Ever. Nothing was true, well, the useless things, but I never truly told you anything about myself that was true. You see, I couldn't. I can't still." And just as quickly, did the shoulder pull itself forward and the glint of steel flickered off the shiny edges of the stools. "But I can tell you right now that I'm not here to do anything harmful to Konoha. Never. I swear it." "What good is a liar's word?" she shot back scathingly. His eyes met hers. And once again, just like when they first met, she was pulled into the swirl of perfect blue that centered on his iris. It was nothing but pigmentation, she had to remind herself. Nothing but good genes and lots of ancestors with pretty eyes. But there was something about the way his eyes glowed so dimly with the rainy clouds, and how they were so deeply ingrained with the swirl of the sky, that they looked nothing like the scientific explanation of them, but as if they were actual windows into the soul. He was an interesting person, this Naruto. With his intricacies and his quirks, and the way he let you finish his sentence that way he didn't give anything away, or the way he made the most utter blasphemy of excuses and there was no way they were real, but he said those to keep you captivated with their humorous input so that the real answer was never questioned. He was full of lies, just a web that spun around wildly, and there was no such thing as truth. But she was curious. Curiouser and curiouser. "Then prove it," she said suddenly, interrupting both their thoughts. Naruto thought for a moment. How to prove that he wasn't lying, when in truth, there was nothing that he could tell them without telling them the truth. Times like this he wished he was Kakashi, the older, conniving version, because Kakashi always knew how to say the truth without actually saying the truth. If that made any sense at all. "Let's find everyone," he said finally. "And I'll tell you all." She blinked at him in suspicion, but said nothing else. "All right." She nodded, pulling the kunai into her pouch again, but not too far. She didn't know when she'd need it again. "I'll take you to Hokage Tower." "Hokage, huh?" Naruto smiled somewhat whimsically. The old man finally stepped down, Huh? Minato's been Hokage for almost a year now, Rin started cynically. But you didn't know that, did you? Actually I did. Naruto quipped. April 17th, with his address to the people. A bit like his inauguration. If Rin was surprised at all, she held it back. Well, the only sign was the small downward quirk of her lips. You're well read. She shot him a look as they walked. Did your spies tell you that? He rolled his eyes, hands in his pockets. No, everyone knows. It wasn't exactly a secret. Rin growled low in her throat. A bit put off maybe because it was true and she had been bested, because everyone died. Rin didn't say anything in defense, opting to watch the stores they passed in the rain that had turned to a light drizzle. And how's he doing? Naruto asked softly, more out of conversation than out of curiosity, because he already knew. This had to be almost one more year now at best until Kyuubi attacked. Fine. Her tone was clipped. He's been busying himself as Hokage, Obito and I are Chonin, and Kakashi is a Jounin. We still go on missions with him though. But we hardly see each other as much since. She trailed off slowly, eyes moving over to him in a meaning subtlety that wasn't lost on him. I'm sorry. He said again. And I promise to explain it once we get to everyone. Rin nodded slowly, as if not convinced of that. But maybe, she wasn't convinced that this was real at all. She had dreamed of meeting Naruto again. They all had, especially in those terrible months after he left and after a while. She had begun to wonder if maybe they had dreamed it, maybe it never happened. No one knew anything about Naruto, his description didn't fit with anyone in other villages, and his similarity to Minato and his blood record in the hospital were the only tangible threads of him. You shouldn't apologize to me. Rin snarled quietly. You should apologize to Obito. Until now, that is, as said man that had haunted them for 2 years pattered along sullenly with her. And the way her team was affected by it, how Obito was affected by it, made her heart clench. Just remembering that pain that still had left a long and jagged scar over her heart hurt to reminisce about. Rin squeezed her eyes shut. The more she thought like that, the more she realized that she was really hoping that this wasn't a dream. I know. He agreed, eyes soft. I will. And that she was really hoping that this was the right decision, that her personal emotions weren't going to endanger her country because of a possible threat right next to her. She took a deep breath, and made sure that Naruto couldn't read her face, even though the man next to her made no such glance. She wanted to believe that Naruto wasn't a threat. She wanted to believe that what he had been when she and her team had traveled with him, befriended him, that this was the same man that he was then. Or maybe, that was nothing but a figment of his personality and his job, and now the truth would emerge, or would it? How could they know for sure? And it was beginning to make her shoulders tense in anxiety. Naruto, even with his lax and flippant posture and his relaxed shoulders that smoothed out over planes of compact lean muscles that ended in his pocketed hands, was just as tense as she was. For different reasons. He didn't know what to say, but he had already made up his mind. Consequences of his actions be damned. He would have been perfectly fine in telling them his whole story, except for the weight of such a calamity would then be transferred to them, and the entirety of the future may be so different when he returned, or maybe there wouldn't be a future at all. Unlike Rin, he wasn't worrying for his country's safety. He was worrying for the world's safety. The cons and pros were weighing themselves in his mind, throwing in his personal feelings as much as he was trying to keep them out of the scale. And his brain was so overloaded he didn't even know where they were going. Rin looked over to his stony face cautiously. She remembered a flash of the red demonic eyes she had seen before, and her doubts, if possible, increased. Little did she know she wasn't the only one who became scared when Naruto was in deep thought, and looked so cold. Naruto. She was tempted to put a demeaning suffix at the end of his name, but decided against it. He blinked at her laconically, as if waking from the sleep. It was as if he was drinking in what he had been looking at for the past few seconds now for the first time, taking in the looming Hokage tower in front of them and the steps that were now at his feet. Yeah. He began to walk up the steps, and she followed slowly. When they entered, Minato had dropped his pen that he had been holding between his lips, carrying a rather large and copious amount of papers and transferring to the pile that was probably the signed ones, and the papers had scattered to the floor in a mess of white, like feathers falling from a bird. The window had been opened, the wind billowing in softly, and the papers went flying everywhere, like a whirlwind of sallow that dusted over the room in its papery mess. It was going to be a real hassle to clean once this entire mess was sorted out, because that was a lot of paper. But when the identical blue eyes met, Minato was left to gape in shock. Rin had expected such a reaction, but still had flinched subtly. Naruto knew that when this was all over, he would look back at this and laugh. "And Naruto?" the Hokage said the word gradually, almost skeptically. Naruto waved with a placid smile on his face, a bit melancholy. "Hi, we're waiting for Kakashi and Obito to get here, sensei." Rin butted in coldly, not to her teacher but more to Naruto. "So that way he can explain to us," she added, as if to jeer. "All right," Minato said slowly, watching Naruto with those same, cobalt eyes. Obviously distrust was something in the bargain here, but there was something very, very off about Naruto. And it wasn't just because the man had been missing for 2 years and suddenly he had appeared again like it was completely expected of him, even waving and saying hello in greeting and appearing with Rin at his side, although something told Minato that was because he was nervous more than anything. That was odd and reason enough to think that something was off with Naruto. However, he somehow overlooked that and was actually noticing something altogether very different. It was because of the way he looked. He couldn't have been a day older than what he had looked like 2 years ago. Same slightly chiseled jaw, and the cheekbones that were set high and protruded a bit to round his eyes out more. Those same cheeks still had 3 whisker-fine scars on them, matching and made him look a bit like a fox. Even his outfit was the same. He had the same black and orange jacket, and black cargo shinobi pants with the standard sandals and the fingerless gloves, although his shirt had changed. He hadn't grown at all, and his hair was the exact same length down to perfection as it had been in his memories. His eyes were still clear and blue, although no longer shrouded in the mirth they had been. It reminded him of the way grandparents looked at younger generations. And that was enough to be suspicious of him, whether he went missing for 2 years or not. They stood in silence, the paper fluttering between them with the shifting wind and Rin fidgeting nervously in the backdrop of constantly moving white. "You got the position finally, huh?" Naruto smiled weakly, looking around the room at the way Minato had furnished it, noticing it looked a bit like the way it would when Tsunade was done with it. A tad messy with the papers fluttering about, and looked like the way it had when Konohamaru had boarded himself up in here. Wooden panels for flooring and a wooden desk with the word for Hokage on it, and open windows that reminded him of the way Jiraiya used to hop through them and Tsunade used to yell at him for it. Minato watched him closely, and it was different from the way Rin did. It made him nervous. "Yeah. Nice job. Not worth the paperwork though." Naruto was surprised that Minato was willing to make small talk with him, although come to think of it, it did seem in his nature. "So I've heard," Naruto said pleasantly back, and wasn't prepared for the harsh statement that retorted him. "From your own country's cage?" Minato had rebutted sharply. Naruto sent him a laconic smile. "My cage sat on the exact same chair you did, Minato." Apparently the spy theme was rather common explanation for his disappearance. "Don't call me that." Minato bristled, and Naruto found himself surprised again. Not because of Minato's harsh and rather hurting statement, but because it reminded him so much of himself when he was younger, that same fiery temper. "All right, Hokage-sama. This wasn't a fight he had to win. But I do speak the truth. I find that hard to believe." Naruto shrugged indifferently. "It's your opinion." "It is." The Yondaime of Konoha agreed. "But it's a shared opinion." Naruto side-glanced to Rin, who squeaked very quietly at the attention. Naruto was very aware that he was getting into that rather testy edge in his personality, the one that bordered very close to Kyuubi and the one that made Tsunade and her guards on edge, and apparently Rin as well. And Rin didn't even know his reputation, yet there she stood, quietly shaking under the silent wrath of his gaze, hooded and aloof and yet so absolutely dangerous. "You're a danger to the village." Minato slid his eyes shut, voice grave, as if he didn't want to say it. As if he wanted to believe that this wasn't true. And Naruto nodded. You're right, I am. Minato opened his eyes quickly, and Rin's head whipped around, surprised he had said it so quickly. But Naruto met their stares with his level gaze. Rin shivered unconsciously, her scattered memories combining together to remember when Naruto had turned a man's face into a dripping mess with his bare hands. In truth they were claws, but Rin had only seen the aftermath, and the way his eyes had the same flippant quality to them as they held now. But for different reasons than you may believe. Naruto added. I'm not a spy. I don't work for anyone, and I haven't hailed from any other region than Konoha. Okay. Lie, Gushino was from Whirlpool. But they couldn't know that yet. They could never know that. Minato narrowed his eyes. I don't believe that. And Naruto only smiled secretively. One day, he started wryly, making sure his voice carried. You're going to realize everything, and then, it's going to make a lot more sense than it does now. The day you and your country attack Konoha? The Hokage cut off with fierce eyes, and Naruto was once again reminded of himself. Naruto opened his mouth to speak. There is no sensei, what the hell happened to this place? Obito's tone was light as he padded down the hallway to the Hokage's room. The papers must have fluttered all the way into the hallway, scattering into the wooden rooms, and must have looked quite amusing to Obito, who knew nothing about what was going on in the room. And then he stopped. And frowns. Naruto. He breathed, and he didn't even have to see the front of his hero's face to know exactly who was, because Naruto looked exactly the same from the day he left. Untouched by the streams of time. Rin was not fazed, already accustomed to the shock of seeing Naruto after encountering it herself and watching the fiery storm that Minato had brewed as well. Obito, where's Kakashi? You didn't bring him with you? Obito's eyes didn't leave Naruto's back. No, he is still in the hospital. Fine, but he needed to sleep some more. Obito slowly regained his composure, voice pieced and cut because he had to keep reminding himself that Rin was asking something. I didn't think it was anything big, but the black-haired Uchiha trailed off, and he blinked slowly, almost owlishly. Drinking in that this was real, not a dream. He had had many of those, wishing for Naruto to come back in an almost similar fashion as this, but as reality. And Naruto, you. Obito choked on his words, a familiar stinging running up his nose and into his eyes, burning them as if his Sharingan was suddenly manifesting. Watching the cloudy sunlight hit the blonde hair, and Naruto smiled pleasantly at him, not mad, not happy, just pleasant. And for some reason, Obito found that off. Seeing Naruto so off-kilter and so unlike the way he was before, determined almost. When the last time he had seen Naruto, the man was always so unfazed by his surroundings, laid back and still intense in a private sort of way. Seeing the determination and that intensity louder this time, as if it spoke in volumes, made him shiver unconsciously. Since you're all here. Naruto's tone was light. You should all take a seat, this could take a while. Rin and Obito tentatively did as they were told, seating themselves into chairs on opposite walls. Minato didn't. I'll stand. He sounded miffed. Naruto shrugged. Well, I'll start from the beginning. I wasn't lying when I said I was born in Konoha. I've lived my entire life in Konoha, and I'm a jounin of Konoha too. Liar. Minato seethed. You're not in any of my records. Oh, sorry. Naruto laughed sheepishly, rubbing the back of his head. I will be a jounin of Konoha, and I will live my entire life here. The three sat in silence, the correction of words slowly churning in thought in their minds. Anyways, so when I said I was a sealing master, I meant it. I learned from the best. I'm sure you know of him even though he may not know of me yet. At first, I was just learning how to make the seals on explosive kunai, and boring things like making a blood seal. Naruto pattered on. And then finally, I hit another one of those big unexplained theories in sealing. After I had successfully made a leaf into grass, I was allowed to learn the vast amount of theories on time traveling. No. Rin sucked in her breath. That's crap. Obito hissed. Minato was taken aback, the only true sealing master besides Naruto, and had learned of some of those theories. How? Silently, Naruto pulled out a pocketed scroll, and it split open as it hit the floor. It was a 4-part seal, of slightly overlapping circles that at least Rin and Obito looked like nothing more than an odd mixture of characters they had never seen in their lives. To Minato, however, it was most definitely another story. My sensei had allowed me to travel around as I pleased, instilling the safety insurances that were the normal precautions for anyone traveling to a new place. Naruto said in a drawl, remembering how terrible that was. And it worked, for a while. I traveled to different places, different times that were alike and yet so different. I even saw myself younger a couple times. Naruto chuckled. His eyes and voice softened. And then I came here. I thought it was funny when Rin tried to throw kunai at me, because I had the same height as her and she still thought I was the enemy. Rin pouted, although it was lost whether it was in good nature or not. And then I saw the yondaime. He continued, looking at Minato's hopeless and lost face in front of him. And everywhere, especially in Konoha, he was a hero. Everyone knew about the yondaime, and what he did for the country in the war, among other things. But when I met you in person, it was one of the coolest experiences in my life and I couldn't help but tag along. Naruto said softly. Minato clenched his fist as he watched the flickering emotion on the boy's face, and then looking down to the perfect time, scroll at his feet. He thought about it for a long time. Impossible. He decided suddenly, even though the living proof was right there. It's not, it can't. Naruto watched him struggle confusion with his aloof eyes, watched as his students looked at him with empathetic eyes, because this was a decision that he had to make, and they would follow. Do you remember? He asked pleasantly, noting how Minato's eyes didn't leave the scroll. You must have been 12. Maybe 11 or 10. You had even come up to me, said my name was weird because it was like the things in ramen. And no. Minato denied it quickly, even though his memory had pieced together a smiling blonde-haired fellow, who was quite a ways taller than him, backdropped against a pretty delphinium blue sky dappled with clouds on the horizon, and had watched that same sky with tired, sad eyes. And we went out to ramen, and then you bragged about Jiraiya, and after he showed up I decided that I would leave you two to your own. Minato was watching him now, the truth welling up, and he knew it was the truth this time. And do you remember what I asked you? He held his breath, gambling everything that Minato would remember, a fellow with sunny blonde hair that was a part of a small memory from a time when he was nothing but a hopeful genin. The breath sucked through his teeth and gave him a cold lightheaded sensation as he watched Minato's eyes flicker around, in confusion and understanding and just about everything in between. Rin and Obito fidgeted in their seats. This story should have been labeled as an utter craziness, a lunatic in their sights, yet they couldn't believe that you asked me if we'd meet again sometime. Minato sighed. And we did. Naruto said simply. It was those words that made it seem so absolutely simple. Just so. Yeah. Minato nodded. We did. Rin leaned against the cool wood of the large oak tree. It was wet and the bark felt odd with its ridged edges and jagged lines against the soft hairs on her cheek. The leaves were starting to change color bit, the edges a russet and the leaves fluttering around the large clearing. Her hands clasped the hem of her shirt like a delicate pair of butterflies. Her hair was limp and the color of smoothed wood, falling against her face, and her eyes were watching the young man in the center of the clearing. Leaning her frame on the tree, she began to wonder what exactly she was doing here, and started to contemplate her reasoning as to why she was here, and why it had entranced her so. A little ways in front of her, a small slope met the beginning of the clearing, surrounded in a line of dense Konohagakure trees that blocked out all of the bustling city noises some miles away. Minato sat cross-legged on the small slope, arms propping his torso up and his flaxen blonde hair moving slightly in the wind. Rin couldn't see his face from the angle, but his tense shoulders gave off all she needed to know. Obito was sitting next to her sensei. She wasn't exactly sure how much of her sensei the Hokage was anymore, hands clasped behind his head and laying on the soft grass that colored green, flecks of it splayed in his hair from his endless fidgeting, maybe out of nervousness. Nearly moments after Naruto had told them what little of his outlandish story he could, he had quickly scurried off to the particular clearing, intent on making a large permanent seal. That way what happened would never happen again. Personally, Rin didn't believe any of it. She hoped that it was true, for her sake as much as Naruto's and everyone else's, because if it wasn't, well, she didn't want to think about that. Naruto was practically family. They spent 8 laborious months of lame D-class missions to extreme butt-kicking B-class ambush ones, and yet it had all fallen apart when he left for an extreme 2 years. 2 years of worrying, of betrayed emotions and slaughtered trust. And now back again, scurrying around the clearing on a massive sheet of rice paper, with brushes sticking out behind his ears and a large pot of ink so that he had enough of it to fill the entirety of the paper. He danced around the large sheet of paper with light feet, making sure not to step on any seals that he'd already done. "Sensei," Rin whispered softly, so that she couldn't be heard over the wind. "I don't trust him." Minato looked over his shoulder. His eyes had lost the harsh steel edge they had adapted into at the office, ever since Naruto brought up something about Minato and Jiraiya and ramen. Rin didn't understand. But whatever they were talking about was enough for Minato to give him and his far-fetched idea a good shot. "I know," he said urgently. She growled a bit, low in her throat. "Then why are we here?" "You don't understand, Rin," he told her morosely, and it reminded her of the times he spoke to her and all of Team 7 when they were younger and wet behind the ears. "Well then make me." She frowned petulantly. He shook his head. "It's not something that I can't just tell you, Rin. It's hard to explain." Obito shifted a little again, plucking grass out of his head and turning his attention away from Naruto. "I believe him." Rin shot him a look. Minato smiled at him a little. "I mean," he clarified, "it makes sense, you know? He said that he specialized in sealing, and no offense to Naruto, but he doesn't strike me as the kind of person that could ever be a spy. He's too emotional. He saved our butts that one time, and he's just, you know, Naruto. I feel like I've known him for a long time." Her eyes once again moved slowly to Naruto's bustling form. Most of his bangs were clipped out of his face, although most still flopped over anyways. His pants were rolled up, sleeves rolled, and his face was smeared with ink where he had wiped it with his hands, toes and hands messily covered in choppy bits of ink. He was currently hovering over a small ink-laden spot near the corner of the immense drawing. Not a sealer herself, Rin couldn't even begin to digest the very workings of such a large and complex seal. Minato, however, was fascinated. Much to her digression. So, theoretically speaking, he had moved from his spot near Obito on the slope, to hovering over Naruto's shoulder to take a better look at the artistry. If you reversed the outer rings of the seal, and reversed the order of each graph, you'd be able to travel forward in time? Yes, theoretically. Naruto echoed, making a large arching motion with his hands over the seals. "It's really fascinating." Minato spoke up once again, more like a child with a candy bar than a 20-some-or-so-year-old Hokage. "Who actually designed this seal?" "Not me," Naruto said quickly. "My mentor was a rather smart man, albeit his rather unorthodox tendencies to things unrelated to sealing." Minato looked up. "Sounds like an interesting man. I'd love to meet him." At this, the other blonde smiled softly. "Yeah, you two would get along well. I'm sorry there's so much I can't tell you, but, yeah, I figure if you did you'd create some sort of paradox. That," and Naruto blanched. "My sensei would kill me for even thinking of revealing anything. You should have heard him when I left, rambling on about all this safety precaution. It was terrible." Minato only nodded in solemn understanding. No doubt his curiosity was piqued, but he refrained from asking anything too adventurous. "Has Konoha changed much?" Naruto stretched his back, looking closely at Minato, studying him. Minato noticed that Naruto did that a lot with people. Identical watercolored eyes stared at each other, and Naruto finally spoke. "He must have found what he was looking for," Minato speculated. "Not particularly, no." Naruto shrugged, continuing to work. "I mean, obviously new heads have been placed on the mountain, shops come and go. Although you'll be happy to know that Ikiraku's ramen stand is still alive and kicking 18 years in the future. Minato brightened. Now that is a good thing to know. Yeah, Naruto smiled slightly. Not all that much has changed. New allies, new alliances, new. He stopped slightly. Enemies. I'm sure. The Hokage turned serious. Naruto watched his seals carefully, making sure that his conversation wasn't messing up his concentration. Yeah, I wish I could tell you. God knows you could help us, but I don't want to cause the universe to blow up or anything. He tried to lighten the mood a little at the end, but it hadn't worked as well as he hoped. Or maybe it did, because Minato's lip quirked slightly. Yes, well, I'm sure there's something you could tell us. Naruto tipped his head back thoughtfully. Well, of course there were things he could say, albeit the fact that suggesting that the fifth Hokage had extremely enormous boobs might give a tip-off to anyone who had known the princess in her prime. But, they wouldn't know anything about Sakura, and as long as he didn't mention Sasuke as anything more than a brooding bratty prodigy from some big-shot clan, they probably wouldn't know the difference either. Of course, mentioning anything of Kakashi or Jiraiya may set off something, seeing as though neither of the two are dead yet and Naruto was planning on keeping it that way. Maybe there were a few humorous anecdotes he could share. Hey you two. He whistled to the two chonin, who jumped, startled. I know you're listening, might as well hear this too. Obito smiled sheepishly, while Rin tightened her arms that were folded over her chest, scowling. Geez, Naruto grimaced, not even out of her teens and already a bit of a battle axe. Let's see. He plopped down cross-legged on a blank spot on his parchment, tucking the paintbrush behind his ear and smoothing his inky hands over his rolled pants, making them even dirtier than they were. He motioned for the others to follow in suit, and they tentatively dropped down. My Genin team was, well, let's face it, everyone hates their Genin team in the beginning. He smiled wistfully. You see, mine was a bit different. I won't explain most of the mechanics or the reasons for it, but my team had a bit more dynamics than most teams. To this day, I honestly think it was the stupidest and smartest move Konoha ever made to put us all on that team. He finished with a strange gleam in his eye, and from where Rin was leaning on her hands behind her she wondered if his eyes were wet from the reflection of the sky and the blues of them or because he was tearing. Anyways, so a lot of people didn't really like me in the village. I might have deserved it, I was a bit of a prankster, but it was for reasons a lot more personal to them and things beyond anything I could control. Minato's eyes softened, knowing he was talking about being a Jinchuriki. You're not going to tell us why? Rin interrupted rudely, but she wasn't really feeling the manners, and Naruto deserved some jeering. Nope. He grinned. Where would the fun go if I did that? Rin scowled. So there was me, and then of course, there was the damsel in distress. Naruto winked playfully at Rin, who scowled even more. And you know me, Prince Charming, just waiting to help my dear princess out. Sadly, the beautiful maiden was already charmed by a not-so-charming other prince. And a royal jackass. At this point, Rin scoffed. Oh, he's a jackass because he got the girl before you could? I think you are just being a bad sport. Oh yeah. He rolled his eyes nonchalantly. And then the guy goes off to slam an electric jutsu into my chest, destroys my left lung, and then runs off to betray Konoha. Obito's jaw dropped, Minato's eyes widened, and Rin momentarily stopped her jeers. That's not funny, she said finally, deciding that the whole thing was just a big joke. Naruto only smiled. Well anyways, story of my life. We split ways. My beautiful princess goes on to be a medic nin. I haven't really talked to the royal jackass because whenever I do he's trying to skewer me with kunai. He sent a look to Rin, as if meaning to be childish. His way of showing the love. That's it? Obito frowned. There's gotta be more you can tell us. He paused momentarily, eyeing carefully the reactions on their faces. Rin was still put off and distrusting, Obito was curious, and Minato was interested, but harder to read than the others. I have had two sensei in the entirety of my 18 or so years. He decided that if the universe would blow up and or he created some sort of paradox then it would have done so already. One of which, was Jiraiya. The other, well, you'd never guess and I'd never tell, so I think it'll continue to be a secret. Jiraiya. Minato sputtered. Wait a minute, when you said unorthodox tendencies you meant spying on the bathhouse. He nodded sagely. He was a good man, good soul. Alas, our large-breasted Hokage packs a very powerful punch, and he didn't stand a chance. Large-breasted, powerful punch. Rin muttered to herself, pulling pieces together. Your Hokage's Tsunade. Yeah, Damoba-chan can pack a punch. Naruto tenderly rubbed his arm, even to this day it hurt to think about when she broke his arm with the punch aimed for his head. He'd never miss his tax reports again. Wait. Obito started quickly. Are you sure you're supposed to be telling us this? I mean, couldn't you be changing the future or something? I might be, I might not be. He said impassively. I could be changing things around, or I might not be changing anything at all. He shrugged. Minato caught on quick. What do you mean by that? Again, he shrugged. Tsunade. Rin breathed. That must be so cool. Tsunade's a Hokage? She's still in Konoha? Oh my gosh. The many medical phenomenon she's solved. Rin proceeded to mutter to herself the many jutsu and medical theories that Tsunade had discovered in her time in Konoha, and a massive list of achievements the woman that Naruto had come to know as the old hag had made. Truthfully, Naruto felt humbled listening to Rin babble. Sakura did it all the time, but it was different. It was Sakura, she babbled about everything. Maybe he should have given Tsunade more credit. He had always just figured she had kind of coasted her way through medics with her reputation as the granddaughter of a Hokage. Granted, she was still a reputable medic. Apparently, that wasn't the case. I think we've broken her. Obito whispered fiercely, and Minato chuckled. Oh. He turned to Naruto, all skepticism lost in the moment. What about your parents? Can you tell us about them? Naruto stiffened in a swift jagged motion, and he let out a discreet breath to calm himself. It went unnoticed by Rin and Obito, who were much too young to be able to notice such subtleties, but Minato caught it like a hawk's eye. Well. Naruto drifted off. I didn't really know them. They died when I was younger. His sentences came out choppy, like he was trying to force them out. So I can't really tell you much about them. I'm sorry. Rin said softly, and she looked like she meant it. He smiled back pleasantly at her. Well, I'm very sure they loved me, and they were worthy people. Both of them gave up their lives to save their country. Their baby also. He mentally frowned, wondering why this anger was rising up. It had been a long time since he had ever felt anger to his parents. Ever since, well, it never happened after he had met them. That's, Rin gulped, over her disbelieving and doubtful, and now that she was really thinking about it, also very narrow-minded, look on things, she had been trying to see things from the other perspective. A very good way to die. I think. Her two teammates shot her the, shut up now look. But she refused to notice. It's honorable, and it's noble, and it proves that cowardice can be overcome. She sent him a sympathetic look. I'm sorry though that it was at the price of raising you. Naruto blinked. Almost stupidly. He hadn't expected anything to have come out right today. He had first expected to be completely expelled out of Konoha on either the terms of mistrust or terms of insanity. It was by sheer luck that he remembered the promise he had given Minato, sheer luck that Minato had even believed him. And now, with both Minato and Obito steadfastly believing him, it was more than he could have ever wished to hope for. He certainly hadn't expected Rin to go along with it. She had blossomed into more than just a naive little girl with big dreams to be a medic nin. Rin was now someone who looked at things for more than just face value, a good trait in the shinobi world. It wasn't helping him now, but that was fine. Naruto had expected it to take a couple days, weeks even, until Rin accepted his theory. Even by a sealing master's rights, this was an outlandish story. It was definitely a miracle that she even believed this, and seemed to be forgiving him. It's alright. He said finally. I've met a lot of people and I'm happy with where me and my parents stand. Even if it is nothing more than platonic friendship, he could live knowing that he had met them. He had defied time, and he had met them. That was enough for him. He had first expected to be completely expelled out of Konoha on either the terms of mistrust or terms of insanity. It was by sheer luck that he remembered the promise he had given Minato, sheer luck that Minato had even believed him. And now, with both Minato and Obito steadfastly believing him, it was more than he could have ever wished to hope for. He certainly hadn't expected Rin to go along with it. She had blossomed into more than just a naive little girl with big dreams to be a medic nin. Rin was now someone who looked at things for more than just face value, a good trait in the shinobi world. It wasn't helping him now, but that was fine. Naruto had expected it to take a couple days, weeks even, until Rin accepted his theory. Even by a sealing master's rights, this was an outlandish story. It was definitely a miracle that she even believed this, and seemed to be forgiving him. "It's alright," he said finally. "I've met a lot of people and I'm happy with where me and my parents stand. Even if it is nothing more than platonic friendship, he could live knowing that he had met them. He had defied time, and he had met them. That was enough for him." Obito nodded sagely, taking everything he had said word for word. Out of all of them, Obito was the most open and trusting. Naruto believed it to be a good and bad thing. Minato was more skeptical, nowhere near in, and he assumed Kakashi, but the relationship he shared with Kakashi in this time period was nothing more than acquaintance, but still a bit of doubt. But Minato knew his seals, and he was formidable in them enough to know that this was a true time seal. And eventually, he'd make the ultimate Jinchuriki seal, the one on his stomach right now. Rin nodded as well, already caught up in her normal female empathetic emotions to say anything else. Surprisingly, Obito was the one who caught on. "Wait a minute, happy where you stand? I thought that, you never knew them," he pointed out, frowning. "True." Minato blinked. He had overlooked that. He was a bit busy thinking about who Naruto's parents were. Naruto jumped. He hadn't meant for that to slip. Rin frowned. She had just opened up and trusted him, and now she already believed he was faking the whole story. "Well, I actually didn't pick this time period just randomly," he began lamely, not knowing how to say the truth without revealing anything. "I actually came to see my parents." Obito's eyebrows shot to his hairline. Rin blinked. Minato, however, nodded. He had figured. "And? Did you see them?" "Yeah," he breathed, smiling slightly. "They really are good people. So you time traveled to get closure?" Rin whispered in awe. Whether in the entirety of the whole time traveling thing or because she thought he was stupid to threaten the balance of the world was beyond him. "And that's where you've been going when we didn't see you here?" Obito put the pieces together. Well, not exactly, but Obito had just given him a good cover. So he nodded. "Yup. That's." Minato was starting to say something, but he became distracted by the droplet that had hit his nose. Naruto looked up, alarmed. The sky had darkened as they talked, and a slight drizzle had taken Konoha by siege. He jumped, quickly using one of Yamoto's few Makotan jutsu he had taught him to bend the trees to move over the seal, creating a canopy of leaves and wood to surround the large piece of parchment. He didn't want to create a large Doton jutsu to cover because then it would look too conspicuous. What could the officials say to a few bent trees? The only person who could have possibly done so would be a deceased Hokage. Time travelers didn't count. The rain had begun to fall more steadily, the pitter-patter was becoming audible and the other forest trees had begun to sway. Naruto finished his jutsu by placing a water-repelling jutsu on the paper. It wasn't enough to hold off a downpour, but if water ran down from the leaves it would be enough to hold it off. He turned around to see Rin gaping at him like he was some sort of scientific phenomenon and Obito gasping at him like he was God. Minato had his arms folded, looking exasperated. "Is there anything you can't do?" Minato whispered with a grin. Rin clapped her hands. "Makotan jutsu. Wow. Just who are your parents?" "Sweet. That's so cool." Obito smiled lopsided at him. He rubbed the back of his head. "Hey, you see, my sensei when I was a chonin was this guy who could actually use Makotan jutsu. I don't really know the mechanics of it, but he did teach me the basics. Or at least, the basics I could use without being related to the first." Still cool. Obito repeated. Naruto laughed. He picked up his portable sealing kit. Well, more like a container with ink cartridges and a couple spare brushes. Why don't we get back to the village? He smiled at them. I need a shower. Rin gave him the once-over. Definitely. Minato sometimes felt both blessed and cursed to be the Hokage. Cursed, when his many assistants came in with copious amounts of paperwork that continuously flooded his office by the house. The worst were the ones that had little to nothing to do with him, like fixing a pipe in a leaky building, and the second worst were the political issues that slapped him in the face. He personally hated the council with nearly every fiber of his being. The least they could do was hold elections, not just appoint clan heads whenever they see fit. And then there were times when he rejoiced, because of the sheer knowledge he now had access to that made everything just so much easier. The sun was barely coming up, and he had rushed into his office and opened the Konoha vaults. He was now looking at a large tapestry that was spread over most of the flooring in his office. It held everyone who was born in the last 20 years, their parents, and things about them. Something like a family tree. Except, these were usually used by medics looking for genetic diseases, not Hokage looking for any sort of match. Well, Naruto was born around this time, so that must mean his parents were about this age. It was a long shot, and it would take an extremely long time to be able to hound out all these people, especially a one that would match. Alright, he was desperate. He had a hunch, and he needed to know if he was right. He remembered Naruto the day he had met him, his reaction. The shock. The surprise. The anger. It was an odd glint in his eyes, but Minato was sure it wasn't a pleasant one. If he was right, then everything would fit. He was near certain, just looking at their identically perfect blue eyes. And he was blonde, not entirely uncommon in Konoha, and they weren't exactly the same shade. Naruto was a bit darker, which made him believe his mother had darker hair. Their skin was close though, and he was sure if he went into the sun a little more instead of cooked up in the office he'd have that tan. But he chewed his lip, squatting down near the near-endless list of names. Was it possible? Hokage-sama? His lousy intern, he didn't want one, but his secretary was thinking of going away for vacation and someone had to be decently trained to be the secretary of the Hokage. Apparently, it was a job description all on its own had opened the door, ripping the top part of the tapestry with a loud rip. And then, the intern proceeded to gasp and jump, making the tea she was carrying splatter onto the now ripped and wet part of the tapestry. He wanted to bang his head. "I'm so sorry." She set the tea down quickly on a table next to the door, pulling a form out from under her arm. He groaned. More paperwork. An unidentified Anbu has been released out of the intensive care ward in the hospital and... She gulped, watching his fiery eyes. The new hospital policy requires you to sign a form for a blood test to be done to find any relatives. He paled. Unidentified Anbu now needed signatures from him to get consent for all their treatments? That was insane. There were so many forms and he was already swamped with paperwork that he certainly didn't need piling on his desk without stupid things like new medicine being prescribed to his Anbu or inane things like a blood test. That's it. He jumped to his feet, and the intern gasped again, knocking into the table and spilling the tea all over the table and the paper. He strode out of his office, careful not to step on any names on the giant piece of parchment, and proceeded out of his office. "Yes sir, wait." She hurried after him. The F forms. Minato quickly swiped the pen out of her fingers, signed a messy signature, and gave the clipboard back to her. "Now, I am leaving for what may possibly take 3 hours. I want that tea cleaned up and the tapestry left spotless." He hissed the word, watching her flinch. "And for all my paperwork to be put on hold." She was left gaping, before she closed her mouth and then opened again to rapid-fire more of things that were so dire and needed his attention immediately. "And by the way, you're fired." And he then opened the window and jumped out of it, successfully leaving her jobless and appalled and with no way to come after him. The hospital was in a frenzy. The attendant at the front desk was swarmed by concerned parents, sisters, brothers, aunts, uncles, even children. Many of the nurses were running around with supplies, and all the medic nin were currently treating a handful of people that had been caught in a burned building. The authorities had put out the flames, but it was a rather busy building. The first floor was a coffee shop, second was an office building, and the last two were apartments, one of which was having a birthday party, and many of the parents here were simply over-concerned because the fire was on another floor entirely. At least, that was what the only nurse available had told him. He had given up the blood readily. A long time ago, before Anbu, he had been squeamish of them, but after a while, he simply decided that they were like kunai. All he had to do was imagine that it was kunai, not a grotesque-looking syringe, watching the blood flow into it. Yuck. The nurse was an old lady, her hair was graying and she had it pulled into one of those odd-looking shower cap things, this one being pink and matching her scrubs. She was mean, even to him. He would have let Rin do it honestly. He didn't know how his young teammate did it, but she made it painless when she gave shots. But then Rin was a curious being by nature and would immediately ask why he wanted one. And that was an answer he didn't want to give her. The last thing he needed was her running off to Naruto and demanding, in that way of hers, with her hands on her hips and her lips pursed, to know if him and Minato were. God, he couldn't even say it. Really, he could barely even wrap his mind around it. She pulled no, wrenched the needle out of his arm, and he held a wince. Oh, was he in captivity in Iwa now? He was pretty sure that hurt like torture he had been through before. The old nurse told him to wait for a couple minutes, and lie his head down so he didn't get nauseous. She said it would take about a week or so to get his blood tested, and then compare it to the sample they had of Naruto's on his file. He had told her to keep that in secrecy, claiming Anbu material or whatever. He hoped she at least didn't go blabbing that he got a blood test. The last thing he needed was the hospital running around giggling about how the Hokage apparently got blood work done for an STD or something. And then have Kushina with an axe ready to come after him. He stuffed his hands in his pockets, and belatedly realized he didn't want to go back to the tower that awaited him with paperwork anytime soon. It was by chance he ran into the one person he was milling about. Oh. Minato. He turned around, and smiled. Naruto was balancing a paper bag of groceries in one hand, and another cradled to his chest. Minato waved. Naruto. What are you doing here? He asked. The blonde grinned. Just some grocery shopping. I'm renting a block away from here, although the landlady was kinda upset I stopped payment for 2 years. He said sheepishly. But I did pay extra before I left. Time travel, huh? Minato laughed, as if they were just joking around. Naruto laughed too. You gotta love it. I think I'm stinking my place up with all those ink pots though. But hey. Let me go and drop this stuff off and let's go to a kairaku with Obito. Sounds good. The two were walking side by side, and anyone who didn't know them would have suggested them to be brothers. Minato luckily had enough sense to change out of his Hokage robes, and was now in standard shinobi wear of slacks and a shirt with arm gloves. Sandals, of course. But most people knew who he was by his face. Naruto, however, didn't seem to be a shinobi at all. His hair fell on his face without his high tie, and he had cuffed baggy jeans and just a normal t-shirt. He had a nice apartment, with a good view of the park across the street, and on the 3rd floor you could see a little past the walls to the mountains in the distance. Minato wondered where he got the money, because honestly, he doubted it was a smart investment to time travel. In fact, it seemed more like it would eat up your wallet instead of help it. But then again, maybe Naruto just made some smart bets that he already knew the outcome of or something. It was possible. I go through the window. Naruto whispered fiercely, motioning with his head to a couple arguing at the entrance to his apartment complex. They do that all the time. And such was the perks of being a shinobi. The apartment was spacious. Sparsely decorated, but it looked decent compared to some shinobi he knew. Kakashi, for example, had a crate box as part of his living room. At least Naruto had decent taste, and a nice kitchen with granite countertop. The walls were whitewashed and the floor was wooden, with long windows that stretched from the ceiling to the floor. Making herself comfortable, Naruto sat between a potato chip bag in his mouth. I'm just gonna run this into the kitchen. He moved into the other part of the apartment where the dining and kitchen were. Minato shrugged, plopping himself onto the couch. Huh. He whispered to himself, looking at a letter that was opened, and sitting along with a pile of other mail. Minato took a quick peek at the hallway, and he heard Naruto faintly humming as he put away the stuff he had bought. Minato gave the letters a once-over, definitely Konoha Post, and most of them seemed like written letters. No magazine subscriptions or anything. He figured because there wasn't a point in them when you traveled time, who cared about news when you'd be 20 years before it happened anyways. He scanned at their dates, and gasped. All of these letters were from over 19 years in the future. He bit his lip. He shouldn't. Really. But Naruto would never know. Ah, hell with it. He picked up the opened letter, starting from the beginning. Hey, Naruto, when will you ever tell me about where you are besides the fact that it's nice weather and you eat ramen nearly every day? I mean, we could start with some of the people you hang out with from day to day, or you don't even have to tell me names. How about just personality? I'm sad, Naruto. I wish you could tell me, I wish we could be close again like we used to be. Minato snorted. Who is this? His ex-girlfriend or something? I suppose I should start with myself. Everything's fine at the hospital. Tsunade Shizu has me working like a horse or something though. It's terrible. Shizu? Minato blinked. Naruto dated the Hokage's apprentice? Not bad. I tried talking to Sai. But it's like talking to an idiotic 5-year-old. Honestly, that guy makes me mad. Although Kakashi-sensei and I have been meeting for lunch every couple weeks, just to keep in touch. It's hard, with his Anbu and my crazy hospital hours, and his porn. It's terrible how much he reads that stuff. Even worse that Jiraiya still writes it. But we make it work. Kakashi-sensei. Minato chortled laughter. Even though this letter had a rather sad tone to it, he couldn't help it. Kakashi was Naruto's Genin-sensei. He just couldn't see it. He couldn't. And porn. He never thought Kakashi was pervert. Please write back whenever you get this, wherever you get it. Love, Sakura. Even have to tell me names. How about just personality? I'm sad, Naruto. I wish you could tell me, I wish we could be close again like we used to be. Minato snorted. Who is this? His ex-girlfriend or something? I suppose I should start with myself. Everything's fine at the hospital. Tsunade Shizu has me working like a horse or something though. It's terrible. Shizu? Minato blinked. Naruto dated the Hokage's apprentice? Not bad. I tried talking to Sai. But it's like talking to an idiotic 5-year-old. Honestly, that guy makes me mad. Although Kakashi-sensei and I have been meeting for lunch every couple weeks, just to keep in touch. It's hard, with his Anbu and my crazy hospital hours, and his porn. It's terrible how much he reads that stuff. Even worse that Jiraiya still writes it. But we make it work. Kakashi-sensei. Minato chortled laughter. Even though this letter had a rather sad tone to it, he couldn't help it. Kakashi was Naruto's Genin-sensei. He just couldn't see it. He couldn't. And porn. He never thought Kakashi was pervert. Please write back whenever you get this, wherever you get it. Love, Sakura. Minato contemplated that maybe Sakura was part of his Genin team. It would explain why she was trying to keep in touch with their sensei and why they were so close, without dating. But Naruto had suggested that he liked her, with the whole Prince Charming speech. But in the letter almost seemed like he was giving her the cold shoulder. Minato. He quickly put the letter down where he found it, and swapped it for one of the newspapers lying around on the floor before Naruto could see him snooping into his personal life. The headline read, Sound vs Konoha. Naruto blinked when he saw him. I don't think you're supposed to be reading that. You know, paradox and stuff. Oh. He dropped it quickly. He had originally planned just to use it for show, but now he was genuinely curious. Sound? What's that? Naruto scratched his head, as if finding a suitable way to phrase this. It's a, new shinobi country. Otagakure. I dunno, we don't really get along with them. A while ago, They sabotaged one of our Chonin exams. Chonin exams are supposed to be neutral. Minato stated obviously. Naruto shrugged. Oto doesn't play fair. But I suppose, a while ago for you is quite a leap in the future for me. I guess things have changed. Yeah. Naruto sighed soberly. A lot. Minato watched him sympathetically. Oh, anyways, let's go get Obito before he throws a fit. Naruto smiled at him, and he laughed. As they walked down the stairs, Naruto gesturing to something that he wasn't really paying attention to, Minato noticed the hand gestures he used when he talked. He studied how Naruto and him really did have this odd uncanny likeness to them that was a bit abnormal. He supposed there were many blondes in Konoha, many with tan skin and blue eyes, so he really shouldn't be thinking about this. But, could he possibly? Karen's trembling fingers hit a snarl once more, and, furiously, she tugged her hand out of her hair with a pained hiss. Jugo eyed her with a varied expressions from bemusement to downright disdain as she struggled for something to occupy her time and hands with. The female member of Team Heavy had always been like this, for as long as Jugo had the displeasure of knowing her. Generally Karen started out by struggling fruitlessly with the messier side of her head, and once realizing how futile an endeavor combing her hair was making to be, she'd switch to smoothing out the wrinkles in her shirt. The process, which took about 30 seconds, ended with her hands fisted at her sides. He'd never seen her have such a variety of nervous tics until, well, Sasuke came along. Jugo seemed to be the only one to notice these sorts of things. Speaking of the Uchiha, he'd been taking his sweet time in the meeting room for the majority of the morning, and Jugo was beginning to get bored. He'd been in there talking to Kabuto in hushed tones, and Jugo speculated that the reason Karen was more fluttery than usual had something to do with the fact that they all truly didn't know what this was about. And at this rate, neither did Jugo. Kabuto's visits were, fortunately, short and to the point, usually only involving Sasuke in some small stone-enclosed rooms with one dim lighting. There were many other speculations Jugo could draw from such a scenario, though he preferred not to think of things that ended with an upset stomach, and invariably scarred Sasuke and all the wild rumors about Kabuto coming to fruition. At any rate, the meetings were always between the two of them, leaving the rest of Team Heavy to wait outside like a three-man line of rejects. Suiketsu was looking off somewhere in the vicinity of the dark ceiling in the darkest corner in the room, with this aloof look on his face marred with scowl. His shoulders were only slightly tense. Karen, to his left, was shaking like a leaf and it seemed near uncontrollable. Perhaps she believed they were lining for execution. Understood? The door pushed open slightly, the muffled voices clearing. HN. The, whatever that usually came after this was left out for courtesy only, as Sasuke pushed his hands into his pockets. Be ready by 7, tomorrow. With that, Kabuto turned their direction, and with a cynical, or perhaps lecherous, it was one of those things that was seriously hard to tell, grin he opened the door and let himself out. Personally, Jugo never liked that guy. There was something particularly off about Kabuto, and for that matter, most of the guys in Otogakure. Like he spent the majority of the time watching people bathe, or touched small children in terrible places. Perhaps that was the vibe Jugo had been feeling from him the whole time? Kabuto molests people. He came to the conclusion aloud. Luckily, his teammates were quite used to his far-fetched, usually irritating, and usually untrue, statements, yet this time, Sasuke only seemed to nod, Suiketsu had a look of agreement, and Karen sputtered, and then looked agape. Naruto fluffed his hair with one hand, the other holding out Sakura's latest letter for him to read. A stick of Pocky dangled from his lips, and his usual contented visage had been replaced with a disturbingly morose version that this time's Team 7 had never seen. He looked nothing like the slightly foolish-looking guy that greeted Team 7 with a grin and outlandish stories. Cold-faced and intense-eyed Naruto had a contemplative feel. His studio with its one sofa and small coffee table looked solemn with him standing in the room. The blonde sighed. Sakura sounded worried, as usual, it was engraved into her nature to worry. Luckily, it was over fickle things like his health. Honestly, did she even have to ask? And the weather, not over particularly larger subjects like where the hell was he? He was grateful for the slight reprieve, and would write her back when he got back home. Though this could take some time. His coffee table was filled with Jiraiya had insisted on him carrying a pack for all the crap, and then the pervert had proceeded to collect letters from all his friends along with newspapers, and, sadly, his latest edition of Kuko was crammed in there, for him to read. He'd have to reply to all of them at some point. Shikamaru's wasn't all that interesting, but he appreciated the jounin lettering him all the same. Neji's he wasn't too particularly surprised with, and all it was about was clan politics and whatever he could disclose about his missions in Anbu. He welcomed the fact that Neji had even bothered to write to him. Tsunade's was the most troubling. Orochimaru's recent movements weren't pointing to anything specific, but his lack thereof did. If he wasn't doing something he was obviously planning or mulling about something that Konoha wouldn't appreciate. And Sasuke's team sniffing around his and Jiraiya's seals wasn't anything good either. Orochimaru was planning something and Naruto was beginning to get a bit tired of the bile in his stomach that was usually only reserved for thoughts of Sasuke. While the blonde was engrossed in thought, the young Uchiha perched out his window ruminated on the subject of his most recent thoughts. Naruto's apartment was something of a bachelor's pad. It had a kitchen that was connected to the living room, with dark-colored wooden floorboards that looked as old as Konoha itself. His only furnishing was the cream-colored sofa and the long-stretch coffee table with scattered letters over it. The door to his bathroom and bed was closed so Obito could only speculate on what could possibly be behind it. There was something particularly odd about the of Naruto possibly anywhere. He was an integer one which Obito was beginning to realize he had never really known. It almost felt him in one certain point and him, or one memory, to associate him with a house. It has an artless feel to it, Obito thought to himself. Naruto himself did as well, wearing nothing but a black beater and slacks and a dog tag necklace hanging on his neck. Need something? Obito nearly fell out of the window, gathering his wits as quickly as possible to save himself from further embarrassment. Minato-sensei is going out to lunch, Obito said by way of explanation. Ramen? He sounded hopeful. Obito smirked. Could it really be anything else? The smile lit up his face so fast Obito could hardly remember the twisted, thoughtful look that had once been in its place. Ah! Naruto sank into the deliciously tantalizing flavor of his noodles with an unknown fervor that was usually only unleashed when learning various kick-ass jutsu. Rin's smile wavered slightly. Isn't that more than enough for one day? One day? Obito sputtered with great horror. How about one meal? Minato hummed in a sort of mix between amusement and agreement. It's ramen. Naruto protested hotly. I can't help myself when it comes to ramen, it's like, the god of all foods, food of the gods. You get my point. Rin poked the already soggy noodles in her bowl. No actually, I don't get it. The newly 25-year-old or so he said, and it was the same age he said last year, and the year before that. And the year before that ... had nothing to say in his defense, merely sipping his water, from behind his mask. Well, if 1-inch wonder he would like to discuss something else, he can. Sai had a much too pleasant look on his face. It looked downright weird, especially for something like Sai who generally had no emotions at all. Sakura's wearing a black thong. Naruto interrupted quickly. Said black thong wearing woman looked aghast. Sai jerked his head. That waitress over there has pink. That woman with the weird guy with the top hat. Naruto made vague movement with his head. Blue with a white stripe. Yellow. Sai motioned to the frisky-looking blonde next cuddling with a brunette man twice her age. Green with pink polka dots. The woman was attractive in her 30s with her husband. Honestly. Sakura shrieked, as their voices began to rise and draw the attention of a few tables around them. This is absolutely ridiculous. Trying to prove your manliness does not mean that you show each other up by guessing woman's underwear. Kakashi hummed, looking completely unconcerned, though to be fair, he rarely looked anything but. Well, actually Sakura it is. It's correctly guessing woman's underwear. I am right, right? Sakura blushed furiously, looked at her napkin, and didn't say a word. The hostess had on black with ribbons, nice ass too. Naruto appraised. As the night, and the wait for their food, continued onwards, the competition spiraled into a fierce battle of dominance. However, Sai took the lead. Tsunade's wearing red, with frills. Sakura choked, Kakashi whistled, and Naruto cursed for his broken pride. Kakashi was just one of the most laid-back of sensei, and simply didn't mind his already grown-up little kiddies enjoying some perverted banter. In fact, he relished it and joined in the fun. Sakura, however, had the decency to look completely mortified and didn't say a word during the divulge into perverted, though well-meaning banter. In fact, she looked a bit pink when they started getting engrossed in Kuka's latest climactic ending. With lots of climaxes. But their fun ended by nightfall when Kakashi confessed that he had to leave by noon for his next 2-month recon mission, even though he just returned from a dangerous A-Class 1 earlier that day. Naruto protested loudly, but to his surprise Sakura hadn't said anything. She looked heartbroken to see Kakashi overworking himself so much. She always looked so heartbroken when it came to the members of Team 7. They were her broken family, after all. He made sure that before he returned to the prior time, he left flowers from Ino's shop. He told himself that it was because she seemed so upset about Kakashi, but in truth he knew it was because he was once again escaping from his troubles, and he wanted to compensate for leaving Sakura alone. And even then, he thought guiltily, it wasn't any real compensation. The hill was covered in fresh morning dew, but, to his dismay and fear, it wasn't the only thing it was covered in. Sasuke and Suiketsu stood over the hill with looming shadows that stretched all the way to the bottom of the mount, the sun rising behind them. Dobi, the Uchiha greeted coolly, watching him over his shoulder. Naruto clenched his fists. The weird redhead who didn't know how to use a comb and the weirdo with anger management problems were combining their chakra to open the seal, he realized. The two of them looked weak and worn out. The girl to the point of collapsing. Naruto blinked. He hadn't realized that his inhuman capacity was so much larger than any other human's, or at least not to this point. He didn't even feel entirely drained using the seal. He could still fight at least, but the girl looked near unconscious, and that Jogo guy looked no better off. What the hell are you doing, Sasuke? He didn't bother with their usual jeers. Sasuke didn't even deserve that. Your teammates are dying. And after a short appraisal of their ashen faces, quickly, Sasuke didn't spare them a glance, dark eyes fixed on the blonde. You've been busy, I see. Naruto growled. What are you here for, Sasuke? He spat, eyes darting furiously from the Uchiha, to his teammates behind him. Though the answer was obvious, and Sasuke didn't deign it worthy of reply. He only unsheathed his katana from his hip slowly, the sword glimmering in the sun. Sasuke pivoted and then cleared the stretch of hill between them in a matter of seconds, but Naruto countered his blade with a kunai, feeling the frustration and anger bubbling inside him. You're always such a bastard, Sasuke. He yelled, pulling his kunai forward and deflecting each of Sasuke's strikes. Leaving your teammates to die. Do you even know what you're doing? Tilting his head, the Uchiha stopped his brutal offense to flip backwards. A time seal, correct? Naruto stiffened. Orochimaru is well informed. Said the Uchiha. I don't care shit about your crazy psycho child molester of a master. He said the word master with pleasure, watching Sasuke's back straighten and his lips tighten. But I know that you and your teammates will die before even successfully fulfilling the procedure. He bluffed. Really, Dobi? Have you forgotten what these eyes can do? The Sharingan's Domoe swam slowly in his eyes. I memorized those hand seals and even the correct amount of chakra to power the seal. You can't fool the Sharingan. Naruto knew that it actually took a near double amount of chakra to send himself back, and if Sasuke wanted to get back to this time, he'd have to have about 3 times the amount of chakra he had now, but he didn't want to reveal any of his ace cards yet. Chakra swirled into his hand. You talk like you know everything. Naruto hurtled into him with a full-powered Rasengan curling in his hands, and Sasuke's black-colored Chidori met his with full force. The hillside was reduced into flying pieces of dirt and a jagged hole where a field of flowers once resided. spit dirt out of his mouth and using Kyoba's eyes to see Arlie through tea of dirt Rasengan, the sucked the Y began to collect in his hand like a maelstrom. Sasuke had flipped onto a tree branch nearly 20 meters in front of him, powering another Chidori. Naruto surveyed the crackling lighting wrapped around the Uchiha's hand with a keen eye. Uchiha he may be, but Sasuke couldn't keep up this high chakra fighting style for very much longer and Naruto was going to take advantage of THT. They met again, and Naruto deliberately dodged out of the way, even at the cost of missing Sasuke with his attack. "What are you playing at, Dobi?" Sasuke hissed, as his curse seal started to crawl up his neck. It was Naruto's turn to smirk. "What? Your Sharingan eyes can't tell you?" Again they sprang, but this time, Naruto used a Doton Jutsu to create a large spike of fractured earth, while Sasuke used a Katen. He caught a glimpse of the Uchiha's face in the crossfire, eyes narrowed in thought. Obviously Sasuke wasn't that well informed, because Orochimaru hadn't told him that with Naruto's mastery of the fourth tail, came an affinity to fire. The fireball didn't burn him at all, and he caught Sasuke off guard enough to hit him with his jutsu. "Ah well, we can't teach the ignorant everything." Naruto mock-sighed, between a large slew of noodles crammed into his mouth. Rin squawked in a bout of protest. She stopped poking her noodles and instead threw them at Naruto who, only by his excellent shinobi abilities was able to dodge them as they ingrained themselves into the wall. "Sensei." Rin whined. "Do something." "Like what?" Minato had an easy grin spread over his face, looking comfortable leaning against the counter. Rin sputtered for words. I don't know. Anything." Minato looked contemplative. "Alright, next time we go for lunch, Rin picks." He spoke at last. Rin cheered, and Naruto protested, though the words were lost in the noodles which inhabited his mouth. How quickly things had stretched into normality again confused Minato a bit, but he was in no means ungrateful for the quick and painless change. He had expected Rin to pout and mull for another couple weeks, before finally deciding that Naruto wasn't being spurious about the whole thing. Obito looked content snickering at the pair, sitting between them and making his was around his fourth bowl of ramen, nothing compared to the staggering amount of Naruto's, but a decent collection, but ramen is the best. Naruto's protest this one with actual words, not just gurgles pushed out Rin's laughter. "I mean, I can have ramen every day. You should see me and Kaido. Yeah, this kid from the village. We were great ramen pals, you know." He sighed. He almost said Kakashi. That wouldn't have been good. Speaking of Kakashi. Oh shit. Naruto leapt from his stool in a staggering display of strength, because his chair smacked to the floor and started to roll along the floor. A pit formed from where the stool was nailed to the ground. Rin visibly paled, and Obito comically opened his mouth until the noodles were falling out. "It's his birthday." Naruto leapt from out of the ramen stand, completely unaware of the damage he'd done to his favorite ramen stand. I gotta go back to, well you know." Naruto was rambling by now, and Minato couldn't even make out anything except for the first sentence, and the rest was so muffled and said so quickly that they were a muddle of half-phrases and partial words. "Slow down." He held his hand out to steady the rapidly deteriorating blonde, heaving a breath. "Repeat." Naruto took a breath, and made sure that the ramen chef was in the back, out of hearing range. "It's my sensei's birthday. I gotta go back because I promised my teammate that I would go and surprise him. Aw man, how could I have forgotten? I hope I get back in time." "Your sensei?" Rin echoed. "You never did tell us who that was." Obito muttered. Minato had a knowing smile. "Well, when do you have to be there?" "Soon I suppose," Naruto sighed. "It'll be a whole day thing probably, and it takes a couple hours before I reappear in the future, so I'll actually be there pretty late." Obito frowned. "So you're leaving?" He looked as if the news had just killed his entire day. "Yeah," Naruto drooped, before perking once more. "But I'll be back soon. Like, tomorrow at the latest." Rin looked skeptical, Obito looked downright depressing, and Minato was contemplative. Naruto bit his lip. Sakura would kill him if he missed. not with her dangerously powerful punches but with her heartbroken eyes like the color of lime glass candies. That was a gut-wrenching feeling on its own. Even though he didn't want to leave his father and his friends, he had no choice. Even if they wouldn't believe him and he knew that they were skeptical of his true intentions. He waved and said his goodbyes as quickly and sincerely as he possibly could before sprinting with as much chakra he could pour into his feet, leaping over 7 roofs at a time. It's not that he wanted to skip Kakashi's birthday or anything. Him and Sakura had planned their quiet dinner surprise at a snazzy restaurant on the better side of town for a while now, and Kakashi would be coming back from his latest Anbu mission and it was perfect timing. He'd enjoy it. But he knew that in the end he'd been wondering what Minato was up to at that time. And Sakura, she tried so hard, but Team 7 was falling apart. Had fallen apart a long time ago, and there wasn't much they could do in fixing it. Naruto had gotten to the point where he believed that Team 7 couldn't, and didn't need to be fixed. Kakashi had returned to his Anbu crazy hours, in town at 1 in the morning and already gone by 4. Sakura practically ate, slept, and lived at the hospital, and Naruto was smack in the middle in the most genius and acclaimed sealing innovation in 18 years. And Sasuke, well, Sasuke wasn't even a part of Team 7 anymore. The seal was still in the utmost of perfect conditions when he stopped his high-speed travel and created long skid marks in the dirt. He froze though, this weird, unexplainable feeling moving down his back. Like ice sliding slowly, he looked around, attentive to the muted sounds of the forest. Nothing in particular seemed to have set him off, but he couldn't quite place this disturbance. He'd never had a reason to distrust his instincts before, and he wasn't about to start now. The blonde turned down to his feet, where the sealing paper continued to glow faintly. Strange. It was made to lie dormant when it wasn't a noose, and as an anchor seal, the black ink would glow a bright shade of blue. The dim light was of inky darkness, and Naruto immediately leapt off the paper and rummaged through his pack. The book was nearly a foot tall when laying on its cover, and would take a good hour to find a page that may even have a speck of relevance to his problem, and then take days to fix the problem, and Naruto just hadn't the time for that. After perusing Sealing for Dummies, Book 4, and not finding anything aside from a general rundown of the after effects of seals, none of which were of any use. Since Naruto and Jiraiya were the first to ever branch into the science of sealing, it wasn't like there was some sort of troubleshooting guide he could just look up. But, it didn't look like it was malfunctioning, and it certainly wasn't burning to a crisp in his pocket, so he supposed it wasn't in any danger. And he was kind of in a hurry. He paused though, setting the tome down in deep consideration. What if? He began loud with confusion. This is what the seal looks like when someone is coming over? But who? Jiraiya, he admonished himself quickly. Who else? No one else knew what they were up to, sans Tsunade, but she had no idea how to work seals anyway. With no time to spare, Naruto jumped onto the large parcel, and began to make the required seals. Belatedly, as the iridescent blue shine encased him, and shattered his vision, he realized that Jiraiya didn't have the chakra capacity to use this seal. In fact, no one did. Dinner was a great affair. Sakura had conveniently forgot to mention to Naruto that Sai would be there, so Naruto dressed smart casual, pleased with his jeans and iron pinstripe blue button-down. Of course, he wasn't expecting his taste in clothing and overall self-esteem as a Monto be shot down in flames the moment he walked up to the table. Sai always had different ways to insult his manhood, and never bothered to shut his mouth when doing so. You don't understand, Sakura? Sai was saying. Naruto, like every man, thinks with his Sai. Sakura hissed, looking delicate and altogether like a real woman. She had received no such insults from Sai, and not like the usual sweatpants and t-shirt kind of girl she was. Her small black dress was attracting the attention of every man in the room, or maybe it was just her legs. Sakura had good legs, Naruto digressed. It's fine, Sakura. Naruto muttered, stabbing at his salad with look of irritation and strained amusement. Sai just enjoys conversing about his favorite subject, dicks. Sakura gaped and struggled to dig her heel into his foot. The blonde yelped in pain. Don't say those kinds of words here. She hissed through her teeth, looking around worryingly. She obviously was remembering that it took a year's advance to have these reservations. You'd think she swallowed a lemon. Kakashi grinned through his mask, watching Sakura's face contort from indignant annoyance into shock. Sensei. Sasuke landed some paces away, obviously keeping a more circumspect outlook on their fight. The Uchiha must have realized that this was about fighting him while still conserving enough strength to successfully complete the mission. With a careful and cautious way of thinking, the Uchiha shot a side look to his water-using companion, who was waiting patiently on the hill with his near-unconscious teammates. Suigetsu. Sasuke nodded. To say Naruto was miffed that he had to fight the second best was an understatement, but he didn't bother to say anything. With infinite chakra, he could go on for days. But, the only problem was that to reach that infinite well of chakra, he'd have to tap into Kyuubi's enormous reserves, and that left him more mentally unstable and more susceptible to Sasuke's jeers. And with Kyuubi's influence, he had no idea how that would end up. He could clearly remember the incident with Jiraiya and many more tales than he could handle. It ended with a charred forest that was burnt to cinders and a large stain on the earth that would probably never recover with its teeming demonic chakra engraved into it. Suigetsu was a piece of cake. The water jutsu user of the team was keeping his distance, using chakra-preserving long-range jutsu to combat him. And it was near pointless. He may not be able to turn his body heat high enough to turn water to steam, which could only be accomplished with 3 tails, but he could still dodge them, and it was pitifully easy. This is pathetic. Naruto growled. Fight me, Sasuke. The Uchiha looked tempted, but he didn't. Feeling Kyuubi's chakra begin to intermix in his stream of chakra, his frustration and anger seemed to make him heat up. His mind was slowly becoming hazy, but he could still rein himself in. Shaking his head, he used some of the excess anger to charge at Suigetsu with an unexpectedly powered Rasengan. The man's eyes widened, before he nimbly dodged the near decapitation blow. His side looked like it had been through a metal blender, but it had barely scratched him. The ground, however, did not get off unscathed. A large scar had been torn into the ground like a wicked thunderbolt, jagged and deep enough that the bottom was too dark to see. Suigetsu quickly jumped back until he was a safe distance away, eyes widened and wheezing. He clearly hadn't expected it, and the move was so close that it must have shaken his confidence. Naruto smirked. That was what he had planned on. The rest of the long drawn-out match was him throwing off the man's defense around throwing kunai and Suigetsu dodging cautiously. Finally, Karen looked up. Her face was abnormally pale, and her eyes looked hollow with dark circles underneath them. She looked sickly and near death at the same time, and she breathing was so labored her body shook with each breath. Sasuke-kun. The Uchiha looked over to his near-falling teammates. Aye, it's ready. She finished in one quick breath. Nodding, Sasuke called to Suigetsu. Keep the idiot at bay. He didn't spare Naruto a glance before making his way to the seal. Naruto's eyes widened. The seal began to glow with a brilliant blue, and the ground shook with slight tremors. There was an impassive look on his face as Sasuke purposely walked slowly into the glowing circle, between his kneeled teammates. Impassive, but knowing, as if he was clearly aware of how much this meant to his former teammate. Panic ripped through the blonde. Obito. Rin. Minato, no you don't. Chakra erupted from his feet and Naruto tore through the air, clearing the hill in a matter of milliseconds and meeting surprised Sharingan eyes with the claret red of his own. When he was arm's length away, he gave the hardest push he could, watching Sasuke's surprised face and widened eyes as if he was living a year's time in a second. Naruto tumbled onto the ground in a splatter of dirt and mud. He stood on shaky legs, the world spinning around counterclockwise as fast as his mind could keep up. He watched the world through blurry eyes like watching it through a fish bowl. He quickly stepped back to keep from losing his balance, labored breathing sucking air into his lungs. His sweaty hair drooped into his eyes, everything spun, and he recognized the feeling immediately as that of chakra drain. He cursed, smoothing the bangs out of his eyes with a clawed hand. Sasuke was nowhere in sight. Naruto. He spun, too fast, his vision catching up with him. Rin sprinted over, her small hands pulling at the fabric of his shirt to keep him balanced. She nearly stepped back in fright. "Your chakra," she sputtered, watching him dazedly, the way one would watch a god. He tried to look at her through the corner of his eyes, taking a deep breath of the pollen spring air around him, and gathered all his chakra from wherever he could, pulling it together. "I'll be fine," he muttered crossly. Where's the clap of clashing kunai pierced through his acute hearing, his head whipping past Rin's mocha-colored hair to Obito back-flipping away from another Uchiha. He cursed, pushing Rin out of the way as he flung himself towards them. Successfully interfering with their fight, he stood between them, slightly out of breath. Sasuke landed gracefully some yards away, tutting as he did. "Another Uchiha, I see." Obito, not as gracefully, skidded to a stop in the mud, brushing his face with the back of his hand and smearing mud over his cheek. "Another?" The boy looked at Sasuke with varied expressions, before turning to Naruto. "What's this about? Who is he? Naruto hasn't bothered to tell you?" Those Sharingan spinning slow circles in his eyes. "Naruto, I'm shocked. You run off to this place and you don't even bother with the common courtesy to tell them about you?" He growled in frustration at their reviled, mocking words. Obito sent him a questioning look, but didn't retort. "So this is where you go?" Sasuke muttered, peering around with an air of disdain, but not letting his guard down. "Pity, I thought you'd go somewhere a bit exotic. It shouldn't concern you, at any rate." He frowned, eyeing the way Obito and Rin cowered slightly at his looming red tails. "You won't have very long to stay anyways." "Why do you say that? Your teammates can't keep the portal open forever. They're at chakra exhaustion already." Sasuke snorted. "And you, yourself aren't?" Naruto narrowed his eyes, watching as the forestry blended into a scenery of towering metal bars, the stench of sewage and dripping water overlapping his senses. He opened his eyes to the enormous pair that met his gaze, two golden eyes placed above a row of razor-sharp teeth the length of his arm. "How much longer can I keep this up?" he asked softly. A low, amused laugh met his ears. "Oh, I suppose it really depends on you. I could keep this up for hours. With my sanity in check, if you don't mind." Naruto hissed. With an amused swish of his tail, Kyuubi pondered this, as if mocking him. "Well, perhaps you'll just have to find out." The bars blurred with the apple green of Konoha forests, and suddenly his reflexes caught the blade slamming towards him with a kunai, his widened eyes meeting Sasuke's Sharingan, before he pushed the Uchiha off him and sent him flipping through the air. "Haven't I told you, to never take your eyes off of your opponent?" Naruto couldn't remember such a time off his head, but he was sure that somewhere, amongst the sealed memories of Sasuke and him, sometime before everything when the two could just be. When it was not a question of Naruto or Sasuke but of Naruto and Sasuke. Don't recall that advice. He opted for, instead. Naruto turned to Obito. "Take Rin and get out of here. But just listen to me, Obito," he said sincerely, and the Uchiha paused in mid-shout. Skeptically, and nonplussed, the Uchiha slowly backed away with a nod of his head, as Naruto turned, sprinting over to Rin and grabbing her hand. They wouldn't be gone for long, he'd have to finish this as quickly as possible. The last thing he wanted was for an idiot like Sasuke to spill everything he worked hard to keep a secret. Sasuke watched them, poised with his blade swung beside him, but made no move to follow. "Letting your friends escape while they can? What are you here for, anyways?" Naruto hissed slowly. The Uchiha lowered himself into position. "Wouldn't you like to know?" Blades clashed, sprang apart, and met again. Naruto at a slight disadvantage with his much closer range than Sasuke's 4 feet of killing machine. Naruto, however, had the unreadable element of Kyuubi's surprise attacks, the fox finding it amusing to sporadically attack the Uchiha with the overflow of red chakra that layered Naruto's skin. It became a weapons fight, with the two dancing around each other, splattered in the mud from last night's rainfall, the spray of the earth spitting into the air like waves breaking on the ocean. Naruto spun in the air, kunai hitting sword some 20 feet into the air, both falling into the shallow ocean of mud that they had conjured in their duel. Neither moved, Naruto's tails flicking almost anxiously back and forth, the Jinchuriki lowering himself to strike. Sasuke was out of breath. Chakra trained from their Tausal before, and from now. Even for his pedigree lineage and expert training, chakra pools was something you were born with, and Naruto was born with the largest supply known to man. Stamina was his main game. Another clash and Sasuke was forced into defense, blades slashing into his pale skin, blood blossoming onto his shirt and smearing on Naruto's face. 5 tails now, gathering around Naruto's small form, flickering about with mild interest, that crazed look gathering behind Naruto's ruby-red eyes. He concentrated on slowing his breathing, and drawing the rest of his dissolving sanity into one final piece and trying to curb the burst of emotions that rumbled beneath his chest, rattling and roaring for a release that he knew would be devastating. Sasuke leaned back, those Sharingan eyes slowly turning like windmills in a light breeze, reminding Naruto of the first bloodshot look he had at the beauty of the Uchiha clan, watching Sasuke's magnificent Sharingan from one of Haku's mirrors all those years ago. Now, he could look at the spinning black dots in absolute contempt. The cry of 1,000 birds ripped open in the jaws of the sky, and hot blue light steamed from around Sasuke's hand. The wind pulled into a spiraling ball in his own hand, dust and dirt and mud swirling around him from the rising air current that flowed around him. The two clashed into a catastrophic mixture of wind and lightning, setting the scenery ablaze, ripping chunks of earth and deep lacerations, charring grass yellow and crisping leaves into burnt brown. Tails of molten fire lapping against the battered earth, and suddenly the dry grass was dancing in flames. The wind from Naruto's Rasengan feeding the hungry fire gallons of oxygen. Naruto raised one of his hands from his place in the mud. A slop of wet brown earth splattered on his face, and he groaned. Christ, why did he always seem to get into these positions? Oh, that Rasengan and Chidori smashing together. As usual, creating a mess out of the earth and setting most of the area on fire. With a jolt, Naruto sprang up again. Flames slanted in the wind, and around the charred opening Naruto searched for the heir to the Uchiha. A rustling behind him and he quickly parried a strike with a kunai. Sasuke hadn't fared any better than he was. However, his burns and cuts were healing at an abnormally fast rate, while Sasuke's more major burns would need at least a week to heal. He struggled, but he pushed Sasuke off of him, falling into a defensive stance. Why? He asked, carefully watching his former best friend's face. What had gone wrong between them? Was he not good enough? Sasuke snorted. It reminded him terribly of the way Sasuke would sneer at him in their genin days. He'd always clown around, desperately hoping for Sakura's attention. The girl was always swooning over Sasuke, crooning about his eyes or his hair, and never seemed to bother with him. Sasuke, leaning against the bridge, Naruto's memory of how the bridge's red ochre color was so bright, Sasuke looking like a dark spot right in front of it, Sakura's lulling voice over the sound of rushing water beneath them. Sasuke's face, as he leaned over and whispered, "Are you scared, chicken?" Sasuke, leaning over his face, rain pattering around them silently. Sharingan eyes tracing his face, shallow breathing in his chest, before turning, and walking away. "Why?" Naruto shouted this time. Hands clenched against his sides, red-hot tails flickering behind him. Silence met him, nothing but the smell of burning flesh and the crackle of flames. All this time, all he and Sakura did was run away. Run away from their problems, run away from each other. In reality, it wasn't solving anything. Sasuke was still gone, the wound was still gaping and bleeding, and neither of them were doing anything to stop it. Why did they have to be so damn stupid? The answer was simple, it lay in front of them. Sasuke was never going to come home. But Naruto had to know. Why? Sasuke watched him, face devoid. His breathing came out in labored puffs, his shoulders were weak with overexertion. His chakra was low. Power. The Uchiha's dark black hair like the dead of night shadowed his face. Naruto watched him carefully, studying the lines of his shoulders, the shape of his hands. He hadn't seen Sasuke in a long time. The Uchiha was as hidden as the moon on a cloudy night, A bright visage muddled by thousands of clouds, always there and always out of reach. Seeing him now only achieved to bring out bad memories and old wounds. He still hadn't kept his promise to Sakura, still hadn't brought the Uchiha home. But he realized, more and more every day, that Sasuke didn't want to go home. He wasn't a naive adolescent being held against his will. He was a man with a full conscience with a set of his own morals. Sasuke knew exactly what he was doing, with lack of care for those he left behind, not caring if Sakura cried crystalline tears every year on the day he left, didn't care that Naruto always pleaded for him to come home, always wished that he would say yes, he would come back. But Naruto's eyes were opened now. There was no point in trying to change something that couldn't be changed. And there was no point in running away anymore. Sasuke turned, Naruto dropped his guard. The blonde's inner turmoil faded into solemn understanding. He couldn't hurt Sasuke. He knew what had to be done, that Sharingan couldn't be left in enemy hands. But even his blood-stained hands burdened with thousands of souls couldn't lift a wedge in the final blow. Instead, his hands met the dull crack of bone against the back of Sasuke's skull, the Uchiha tumbling into the shallow ocean of mud beneath their feet. Naruto watched him with dark red eyes, clawed hands pulling up his best friend and dragging him back to the overwhelmingly large seal. It pulsed with a foreign understanding, chakra from the other side feeding to keep it open. With a frown, Naruto unceremoniously dumped the Uchiha onto the paper. The Uchiha faded in a deafening roar and azure bright light, ground shaking on impact and a burst of chakra pounding through the landscape. Naruto stood alone, a sobering mood blowing past him like an icy cold wind. What was he doing here? How long could he keep up this farce, that this was all for the purpose of science, of discovery? Naruto couldn't fool himself. He wasn't here for breakthroughs in sealing engineering. He was escaping his problems. He was escaping the war that rumbled somewhere far off in the distance, lingering on the horizon, only delayed by few obstacles. He was escaping Sakura's pleading gaze, emerald eyes filled with worry and hope and trust that he would bring back a man who had no desire to return. Escaping the fear that glazed over his village's eyes, even friends, scared for who he was, what he was and who he would become. Naruto. Rin's distressed call echoed from far off, and his head swiveled to watch her. Her brown eyes were probably filled with concern. He didn't need to see them to know. Obito trailed behind her some paces away, probably surveying the damage to the landscape and the bright red tails billowing into the wind behind him with more caution than she did. But Rin was a woman, and true to their sex, cared more for her friend than for herself. He was surprised to see another blonde herd behind Obito. Apparently they were smart enough not to call Anbu to help him. The last thing he wanted to do today was explain to them how exactly the training ground had ended up like this, why there was a 20 by 20 foot charred piece of paper, and the 5 tails that shot up into the pale blue sky. Rin reached him first, auburn hair swinging with her movement. She faltered slightly, eyes leaving his crimson ones to stare forlornly at the long tails behind him. She gulped, and Naruto released his hold on Kyuubi's chakra, knowing the killer intent made her uneasy. So, she started. What? Naruto's brilliant blue eyes were focused on something far, far behind her, gaze darkening. Just some complications. Some complications? Obito scowled as he approached. The training grounds looked like the earth upturned itself and set the ground on fire. You really expect us to believe that? And who was that guy? Rin pestered. Obito's eyes were wild with interest. He was an Uchiha, right? I could tell, from Sharingan. Naruto didn't say anything, only watching the burning paper curl into itself, ashes dusting in the wind. Is he Obito? Rin cut him off quickly. Before hissing, he obviously doesn't want to discuss it. Pursing his lips in a near-futile attempt to stop asking questions, Obito refrained himself. Minato stepped closer, surveying the damage for himself with the cool eyes of someone who had seen worse. A training accident, he announced. Obito, you were trying out a new kata jutsu. Rin, just seconds before that you had used a photon jutsu, so the moisture was taken out of the grass and set it on fire. The Hokage stopped his alibi-making process to look at the lightning slashes on the barks of the trees. And I suppose I was trying out a class right on Jutsu you all. Naruto grinned. Yandame's humor never failed him. But sensei. Rin whined. Why can't I do the crazy cool right on Jutsu? Minato only sent her a wary look. This has to be a credible story. Can you do an A class right on Jutsu? Rin huffed. But the better question would be, Obito began slyly. Why would you use one in a training session with your Chonin students? Huh? Exactly. It'd be more believable if we used it as a last option when we were fighting you. The Hokage huffed in annoyance. End of discussion. We're sticking with my story. Rin sighed. Oh, if I could make a right on Jutsu, I'd name it Chidori, just like birds. Naruto blinked in surprise. So that's where Kakashi had gotten the name of his most renowned jutsu from. Naruto. Obito watched him carefully. What's wrong? Rin spoke up. Naruto smiled at them, melancholic and somber. Guys, I ramen. Obito grinned. That'll cheer him up. Naruto faltered. He had never felt so torn before. Torn between what he wanted to do, and what he knew he had to do. But as he watched their happy, dazzling faces, he knew that he was only delaying the inevitable. Guys, I can't. He said, finally. Obito's expression broke out into worry, but most of all, fear. What? Why? Naruto shrugged non-committally. That man you saw there, he was a former acquaintance of mine. I may have defeated him for now, but if I don't stop him, this time won't be safe anymore. He smiled sadly. I've realized that by going back in the past, all I'm doing will be running away from the future, running away from the place I'm supposed to be. But Rin struggled for words. That's not fair. She whispered. We just found you again, and you're already leaving? I'm sorry. He sighed. But I don't have much choice in this. You guys have to be safe. We're strong. Obito protested. We can protect ourselves. Maybe you can. Naruto pointed out. But there are extremely powerful people in my time that are holding the very foundations of Konoha, but right now, they're probably 2 years old. What would happen if someone used this seal to assassinate them? Obito shut his mouth, tight-lipped. You're right. Rin's gaze fell to the muddy ground. But we just don't want you to leave. Sorry guys. Naruto swallowed the lump in his throat. But it's not like you won't ever see me again. You'll find me again before you know it. He lied thickly. You mean? Obito's eyes widened. Yeah. Naruto smiled, but to him, it felt so fake. I'll probably be born soon, and then you guys can be Antrin and Uncle Obito. Rin grinned shyly. See you then, I guess. Obito nodded. Hey you two squirts, Minato grinned at them. Leave us alone for a couple minutes, okay? Your sensei has to talk to Naruto for a little bit. Naruto watched the two children, or maybe not children, they were growing up fast, disappear past a cluster of trees, leaving him and his father alone. That man, earlier. Minato struggled for words. Was he? He's from Outagakure. I'm assuming he was sent to scout out where I've been going. Naruto filled for him. This is rather confusing. Yondaime smiled sheepishly. But before you leave, I just wanted you to know. He looked at Naruto sincerely. It was nice meeting you, really. Naruto smiled. You too, Yondaime. Minato made a face at the name. When Naruto looked back upon this moment in the future, he would remember how awkward those moments were, as the two struggled for the right words to say goodbye for what the both of them knew was eternity. Naruto pulled out a scroll from one of his pockets. He had gotten used to carrying a copy of the seal wherever he went, just in case he needed to travel to the past or future at moment's notice. Moments like this. He set it down carefully, mangled sentences and fragmented words about to burst from his heart in inarticulate phrases, things he wanted to say but had to refrain himself from saying. For both of their sakes. In fact, he should leave it at that, say goodbye as friends and comrades, let Minato wonder about the future, speculate, but never fully understand. But he remembered Jiraiya's smooth voice, as he spoke with so much pride about his father. About how much Minato would want to see what his son had turned into. How Jiraiya's voice cracked when he spoke of how much Minato loved him, How much the Hokage had never wanted to let him go, how he held his infant son's fingers tightly before the Shinigami's jaws snapped around him. Through the torment of emotions whirling in his chest, Naruto felt words break through the silence, breathless. The seal was flaring between them, Naruto's back turned to the man he had come to love. A sheen of bright blue light stretched between them like the sun's rays peeking from cracks in the clouds, speeding into the sky. He turned around, looking over his shoulder with eyes smoldering in emotion. "Goodbye, Dad." Minato's eyes widened. He pulled for Naruto's sleeve, yelling lost in the scream torn from the seal. His hand stretched out for his son, but met nothing but whirls of smoke from the now smoking paper crackling noisily at his feet. "Wait." His shout met the cold spring air, a pale blue sky above him. "He's a beautiful boy," Kushina was crooning, and Minato tried to overlook her deathly pale skin, and the way her labored breathing filled the room even though she gave birth a near hour ago. Staring into his child's eyes, brilliant blue like windows into the sky, just like they will be in the future, the one you won't live to see, his conscience snidely provided. He was shocked at the resemblance to him, and to the man Naruto would become one day, stumbling out of a cold spring river near the Iwa border, near 20 years in the past. A knock interrupted his thoughts. He tore his pensive eyes away from the blinking delphinium blue gaze that watched him innocently. He opened the door quietly. "Kyuubi." The Anbu panted at the door to the hospital room. Yondaime watched the man's blank rabbit mask with something akin to dawning understanding, fear, and nervousness. As the blonde Hokage closed the door behind him, he could hear Kushina's soft breath fill the sound of the room. He didn't need her to hear this now. Where? Approximately 20 minutes away from the gate. The Anbu shifted uneasily. "We're doing the best we can, but without Jiraiya it doesn't seem that this battle will be won, sir. We leave the worrying up to me," he said coolly. "And try to hold it off as long as you possibly can." The Anbu nodded, disappearing in a cloud of smoke. Minato opened the door quietly, listening to his wife's breathless humming. She was still panting from the birthing, her face pale with stark contrast to her fiery red hair that framed her face, cascading down one shoulder like wine-colored rivers. Seawater eyes focused on the smooth baby soft sunshine hair growing on her son's head. "Naruto," she smiled lovingly. Minato clenched his fists. And the world repeated itself. The mission took a shorter period of time than it should have. Upon arriving, Naruto had tossed the scroll to an annoyed, but equally worried Tsunade at the Hokage Tower, before immediately hitting the closest shinobi bar that he could find, and promptly drowning himself in rounds of Grey Goose shots with Shikamaru and Kiba, the other two dropping out after about the 6th round. Thanks to Kyuubi's ability to regenerate his liver and cure his cirrhosis 50 times over, he kept going for most of the night, until he was kicked out with the rest of the drunken ninja. Unlike Kiba, who had his extremely hot older sister to pick him up, and Shikamaru, who passed out on the sidewalk, Naruto was sober enough to drag himself into a tree, before sprawling the night there. The moon lit the dimming lights of a silent Konoha. The days, or yesterdays, for it was already 4 in the morning, date was October 11th, a day Naruto had conspicuously planned his mission to come home the following day, but due to the fact that the missing nin he was sent to kill were ridiculously easy, he was back by nightfall. At least the festivities were done. As Naruto closed his eyes, between his reflex to throw up and Kyuubi's chakra healing him with hot slices through his abdomen, he wondered what was going on at this very hour, almost 19 years ago. "Minato-sama." Minato clutched Naruto's small, fragile hand with his own, replacing the cherubic features of the infant with the grinning visage of what he would be, many years to come. He pointedly gave the Anbu tired look, and he quickly disappeared to the ground to his comrades, leaving Minato alone. Minato gazed upon the burning crescendo that gleamed in the night. He couldn't feel the hot, fanning flames, only the brisk October air around him. Gamabunta was silent beneath him, Kyuubi's roar splitting into the air and wrenching the jaws of the sky open with such ferocity that the earth shook with its deafening scream. The beast's tail stretched into the stars, as if burning them to crisps. The hot red streams flickering about, almost amusedly. Minato clenched his teeth. That fucking fox. Naruto clenched his finger with his two hands, staring up at him with the biggest watery blue eyes. So pure, so pale they were almost the color of a baby's breath flower. His face split into a grin, the pudgy cheeks rosy tinted, maybe from the fact that he was born a mere hour ago, or because of the brisk air outside. "I'm so sorry, Naruto," he muttered. "You probably knew all along, didn't you? The hell I'd send you to, my scorn legacy I'd leave you with. You'll hate me, I'm sure. Maybe you even hated me when we met, all those years ago." Minato drifted off, pointedly remembering the scant years he spent with his son, grasping to them so tightly his mindscape was flashing through each and every smile. "I'll never know, will I?" he sighed. He was running out of time. Naruto closed his eyes against his father's warmth, snuggled next to him as if it was prenatally ingrained into him that his father was his protector. But was he really? What was he doing, if not giving the beast his son? "But I love you," he whispered to the infant. "So much. I knew from the day I met you, at the Iwa River, that I loved you. But I had no idea who you were. Just like you'll never know who I am." He paused. "Until you're older, I suppose." The baby gurgled, and Minato spent most of his time trying to believe that the infant knew what he was saying, and was agreeing with him. But Kushina was the one who fabricated those kinds of fairy tales, and the yondaime was well aware that Naruto was probably only doing that because he was hungry. Again, Kyuubi's cry shook the night, and Minato knew that he was upon his final hour. But he couldn't bring himself to feel saddened for himself, only for what he was now certain he would be doing to Naruto. "Boss." Game Abunta called worriedly. He shook himself out of his stupor. "Naruto," he began again to the infant, knowing that he couldn't understand but did so anyways. Said a voice to his left, rather conversationally. "I doubt I can understand you, I'm 60 minutes old, after all." Minato's eyes widened. And Naruto only smiled.